Okay, this is John Eastman. I'm the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. Here to introduce Lucas Morel, a professor at Washington and Lee University in Virginia. He has his PhD from the Claremont Graduate School, and he's an expert on Abraham Lincoln, among many other things. Lucas is going to be speaking with us today about the 1619 project that was advanced by the New York Times, a missed opportunity. Lucas, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization for this invitation to speak in its Community or Disunity lecture series. I think this is a fitting theme for the focus of my remarks, which is to discuss the 1619 project in light of what I consider it to be, which was a missed opportunity. The lead essay and the project coordinator was the brainchild of staff writer and investigative reporter of the New York Times Magazine, Nikole Hannah-Jones. She reinterprets American history in light of the Black American contribution to its development, which is a good thing, and I'm going to talk some more about that. But ultimately, I believe it falls short in presenting an accurate account of both the triumphs and the travails of America as we look to our past. By emphasizing the contributions of Black people at the expense of white people, which she does consistently, start to finish. The 1619 project, in her essay, which I'm focusing on, teaches Americans to view their history essentially as a zero-sum game, instead of an integrated, as King put it, black and white together, an integrated struggle for freedom, which it actually was. In doing so, the project founder, Hannah-Jones, makes the nation's progress in securing rights for Black Americans harder to understand, and therefore more difficult to discern any lessons it might teach us, our past, about how to deal with some of our issues today, especially those that affect race. In addition, and I think this was one of the most glaring problems with the essay, is that I believe ultimately that it will undermine the trust that Americans of all races need to have to resolve political differences peacefully and thereby perpetuate our self-governing way of life. It's been over a year since the publication of that entire issue devoted to 1619. I think it came out August 14th to commemorate the 400th year anniversary of when 20 some odd Africans came to shore, not voluntarily. It's unclear about whether they were slaves or indentured servants because in Point Comfort, which is near the Jamestown colony, the English colony of England, I don't believe there were laws about slavery at the time, but the 400th anniversary, broadly speaking, of Black slaves on American soil, the project was designed to commemorate that event. During that year, it's been introduced into high schools. She has won a Pulitzer Prize this year for journalism commentary. She's working with Oprah Winfrey on movie, TV projects. She's working with Penguin Random House on books, a book that will elaborate upon her essay as well as others. I think there were 17 other essays in that magazine. Probably have a graphic novel thrown in for good measure. In short, I would say that the 1619 project was the cultural phenomenon of the last 12 months. And I think because of the history that it addresses, and I believe mangles, I think it deserves close scrutiny, especially because of the claims it makes about, at least at the time, she and the New York Times claimed that the 1619 was the true founding of America, and what that founding, as opposed to 1776, means for what today is known as the legacy of slavery. She and the New York Times, as I just mentioned, have walked back the claim that the true founding of America was 1619, but it's the basic premise of the project, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I think I'm going to mention it briefly later in my remarks. I want to explain why I think her essay has the potential, or had the potential, to advance our understanding of our past, but it fell short on a number of fronts. In short, her essay was not only deficient in its understanding of the American founding and Abraham Lincoln, but also politically divisive in its presentation of American history as simply a case of heroic Black virtue triumphing over persistent white vice. A project that aimed to give Americans, all Americans, a better perspective, a more accurate perspective of our past, I believe failed to do so in an accurate and fair-minded way. She's actually made our history harder to understand. And I think likely contributed to the greater polarization we're witnessing this year. Her essay is really, at the end of the day, and you're going to know that I've been influenced by Ralph Ellison here. It's really an essay about visibility, how we see America's founding and how we see Black Americans, their role in this country's development. Ultimately, it's about how we see each other, both as fellow citizens and as human beings. Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, called this moral perception. What he said, the perception of the wholeness of American life and the cost of its successes and its failures. By wholeness, he meant that despite many decades of enslavement and segregation of Black people on American soil, Americans across the color line were far more connected than they realize. The influences, if you will, went in both directions, even before discriminatory barriers were removed. It's a point that Hannah Jones kind of touches on near the end. She talks about Blacks growing up in the United States as being in unique isolation, and that is not Ellisonian. He saw a lot more cross-pollination, if you will. But as I say, I think she fumbled when she looked at only one side of that connection, the Black American side. She ignored the other side, the majority white America that did not simply act as one gigantic monster of white supremacy throughout its history. And I hope to demonstrate that. Her mistake, what makes her interpretation of American history so bad, was to interpret it, as I mentioned, as a zero-sum story where the recovered strivings of Black folk had to displace the recorded achievements of white folk, especially those that we've long been viewed to honor and revere. What was really needed or called for was a more capacious revisioning and revisiting of American history. We do need to highlight the heroic participation of and patriotism of Black Americans, but we also need to be honest about the challenges and obstacles that the white founders, many of whom were slaveholding founders, faced in trying to establish a free society in a land long accustomed to racial slavery. In other words, long before the Spirit of '76 came along. And we need to appreciate the national crisis that Abraham Lincoln faced when he tried to get Americans, white Americans in particular, to what he said was readopt the Declaration of Independence as the moral compass of their political practice. Instead, riddled with half-truths, overstatements, out-of-context quotations, errors of fact and interpretation about the founding and about Lincoln, Hannah Jones's history, definitely deserving scare quotes, distorts our past, actually works at cross purposes with her own argument that it was Black Americans who fought to make American ideals true. If you skip the table of comments in the magazine issue and devoted to 1619, and you went straight to the lead essay, in the table of contents, it's called The Idea of America. But if you go right to the essay, that title is not present. All you get in huge font are two sentences, followed by the narrative of the essay. And those two sentences read as follows. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when written. When they were written, Black Americans have fought to make them true. She claims the Declaration of Independence does not mark the beginning of a new era of civilization, but yet another notch on the belt of white supremacy's oppressive march on American soil, whose actual birth date was the year 1619 when 20 slaves landed near Jamestown. If you go to Nicole Hannah Jones's Twitter account, you'll see that she has July 4th, 1776, and a line through it. And underneath is August, I believe, 14th, 1619. So she makes clear on Twitter, at least, that those are not equal dates, dates of equal importance. It's 1619 that's more important. Unlike the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who called the 4th of July the first great fact of American history and the birthday of American liberty and independence, Hannah-Jones looks past the statement that all men are created equal and focuses on its contradiction over 150 years before the nation was born. She looks at that as the true foundation of America. She never explains, however, how the spirit of 76 was even possible. How is it even conceivable if color prejudice ran so deeply in white America's veins? She takes this and many other examples of white contributions to the freedom struggle in America for granted. And by for granted, I mean she omits it entirely, except for admitting that Jefferson actually wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence. To her credit, Hannah-Jones ably informs us of many important contributions that Blacks have made to America's political, economic, cultural prosperity. Unfortunately, she presents her cri de coeur under the guise of history, unabashed revisionist history, for those she believes have drunk the Kool-Aid too much for too long of America's mythology, as she would consider it, about freedom and equality for all. While I see her debt to Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and Ralph Ellison pretty evident in her account of the many ways that Blacks have contributed to American progress, she excludes significant facts that would undermine what I consider a very disingenuous argument about the American founders and their greatest defender, Abraham Lincoln. As you might guess, I think the good part or intention of her project is eclipsed by the bad and the ugly parts. So let's begin what could have been a worthwhile contribution to our self-understanding. That's her effort to highlight how Black Americans have been an intrinsic part of the American story from the beginning. I think that the good part of her essay is, as we'll see later, the Ellisonian part. Few commentators on the 1619 Project have focused on what I believe is the main thread of her article, and that was her puzzlement over the fierce loyalty and patriotism of her father, a Black man who flew the American flag proudly on the lawn. It was always in the trim. Here's a man who served in the Army, was harassed, discriminated, discharged under, as she calls, murky circumstances. Here, as we are getting used to saying, unfortunately today, was a man who loved a country who didn't love him back. She didn't understand it until she realized that her father's devotion to America, despite the racial bigotry he himself suffered, owed to his recognition of how much his country was the product of Black American blood, sweat, toils, and tears. To betray or turn his back on America would be to betray the many ways that Black Americans built this country. And so Hannah-Jones comes in the essay to share that she finally figured out what her father understood and what had confused her and actually got her upset growing up. She understood her father's patriotism as it flowed to from his awareness that America's redeeming qualities were, as she frames it, the product of a people, a Black people forged in the crucible of American race through slavery and segregation. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he was the creator of what was known at the time, what he called Negro History Week, what we now call African American History Month. He defined the meaning of what he was trying to do, this Negro History Week, as follows. He says, it's not so much a Negro History Week, but the Negro in history. He said, we should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. In this, I believe it does reflect a laudable concern that Black contributions to American prosperity be noted and learned by all Americans. Du Bois commented on the Black Americans' role in the making of America in his great book, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. So the locutions I'm using, if you hear Negro, it's because that's the word they used in the past. Your country? How came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth the giving? So that's Du Bois. So the point here is to leave Black Americans out of American history is to relegate them publicly, and therefore shaping public opinion. It's to leave Black Americans in an inferior status, thereby promoting or reinforcing white supremacy as the norm. In the words of novelist Ralph Ellison, a people must define itself, and minorities, racial minorities, have the responsibility of having their ideals and images recognized as part of the composite image, which is that of the still forming American people. Black American history, or rather Blacks in American history, is also important as it shows how Black Americans forced white Americans to take their ideals seriously. In a 1970 Time magazine article, Ralph Ellison observed that today it is the Black American who puts pressure upon the nation to live up to its ideals. It is he who gives creative tension to our struggle for justice. A chief way that Blacks have shaped American history is their political activism on behalf of the ideals of the regime. Ellison thought that America could not survive being deprived of their presence because they symbolize both its most stringent testing and the possibility of its greatest human freedom. Aware of the failures of the early American Republic to secure the rights of all Americans right away, Ellison still called the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights sacred documents. He thought that on the basis of those documents, Blacks kept the nation focused on what he called the extension of the democratic process in the direction of perfecting itself. Hannah Jones put it more starkly. It is we, Black Americans, who have been the perfecters of this democracy. So you can see why that sentence took me right back to that 1970 Time magazine article of Ellison's, which says essentially the same thing. It's Black Americans contributing to the perfection of democracy. So if that's the good part of her project, what about the bad and the ugly? It's not hard to point out the bad. The history has been criticized from both sides of the aisle. It doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. It has been under fire almost from the get-go. Historians, economists, political scientists like myself, we've all weighed in and found it seriously wanting in terms of both its argument and its scholarship. For example, Hannah Jones lambasts Jefferson's, quote, fellow white colonists for establishing what she calls a network of laws and customs, which she says were intended to perpetuate slavery, despite their knowing that Black people were human beings. But if slavery was the driving force of American politics, how does she explain that among the 13 original colonies turned states, 6 of them, fairly early in our nation's history, actually got rid of slavery? So if slavery is the driver, if racism is the driver, why did they get rid of it? Why did Vermont, the 14th state, enter the Union with an anti-slavery constitution? She doesn't mention, or apparently is unaware, that in the state of Massachusetts, when they passed their new constitution in 1780, they also had laws that, believe it or not, allowed slaves to sue in court in the case where they were harmed. So there's a case of Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mumbetts, and Quock Walker. These were enslaved Black people who sued for their freedom. They won not on the basis of a violation of the law by a white person, but on a plain reading of the Massachusetts Constitution. The first article of its Declaration of Rights reads as follows: all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Does this count as part of the network of laws and customs that Nicole Hannah Jones claims renders the United States a white supremacist nation? For a nation supposedly founded on slavery, this state, Massachusetts, actually had a constitution and laws written by white men that rather quickly produced not only the freedom of the litigants, it actually abolished the institution of slavery within 3 years of the passage of that constitution, completely missing from her account. She's either aware or deliberately omits these and many other facts about early American political development that contradict her one-note account of Black Americans contesting white supremacy as the driver of American politics. She sees, of course, racism as systemic rather than equality and liberty. Has Hannah Jones, had she read the writings of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others, she would have learned that they not only acknowledged the injustice of slavery, but they discussed the obstacles to emancipation, at least in the near term, especially prior to the invention of the cotton gin. Again, completely missing. The founders were revolutionaries, to be sure, but prudence, I believe, marked their efforts to establish national independence in light of the pre-existing institution of slavery in the 13 diverse American states. During the Revolutionary War and the early efforts to cement a union of the American states, the founders believed they could not free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. To insist on the latter as a condition of the former would have doomed both imperatives. For example, South Carolina and Georgia, plenty of land, not a lot of people. And so they were very hesitant to do anything that would stem the flow of slaves into their states. To lose their support during the Revolutionary War, and we've got to remind ourselves, July 4th, 1776, we've been at war for a year and we're going to be at war for several more years. It wasn't guaranteed that we were even going to be a nation. We were even going to establish our independence from Great Britain. To lose the support of states like South Carolina and Georgia during the war, when only a united effort to throw off British rule promised any hope of success, would have made an already audacious enterprise much less likely to succeed. So as I said, even Jefferson affirmed that all human beings possess natural rights. The slaveholding founders were all too aware that the enslaved had legitimate grievances. As Jefferson put it, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties, produce convulsions, which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race. And he said this in the notes on the state of Virginia. He admitted that deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites further complicated any attempt to free blacks in a way that would enable them to enjoy their natural rights and to immediately to become citizens immediately in the state of Virginia. He thought that emancipation had to be followed by what he called expatriation, or colonization, as they say later, in order to give an incentive to whites over time to free their slaves, as the population was, as it was said at the time, diluted or diffused. It'll be more likely that whites would be open to freeing their slaves, manumitting their slaves, if they weren't vastly outnumbered by them. They were fearful of a race war, had the examples of the Gabriel Prosser revolt in Virginia in 1800, and of course, Touvent Louverture's revolution that began in 1791 in Haiti. According to the lead essay, there's no debate, no struggle among the founders in their efforts to form a more perfect union. They're just, they might as well be called a slaveocracy, not a democracy, she says. To leave out this account of the founders' profound awareness that what they were doing was wrong vis-a-vis the enslaved African on American soil is to leave out an important element of America's political development, namely that we were a nation born of debate, argument, discussion, and usually peaceful resolution. Wrestling with this reality would produce not only a more accurate, a more capacious account of our founding and history, but I believe a much more engaging one for our nation's youth. Their civic education will be more accurate, more lively, and I believe more constructive as they learn about the ideals and leading actors of our nation's history as they struggled with how to make their practice, longstanding practice, align with this new vision, this novus ordo seclorum, this new order for the ages, which is a regime based on consent of the governed, equality, and individual rights. I could say more about the founding, hit me during the Q&A, but now, unfortunately, her essay didn't just trip up on the founders. We're gonna move from the bad of the founding to the ugly, which is her account of Lincoln. To complete her takedown of the founders, she must take down their greatest defender, Lincoln. She claims that Lincoln, quote, believed that free Black people were and then she's got an internal quote here, troublesome presence. So she quotes Lincoln as saying that Blacks were a troublesome presence, incompatible with a democracy intended only for white people, close quote. Now, she's either unaware or omits the fact that this was not Lincoln's view. He was quoting Henry Clay in a eulogy that he gave of Clay in 1852. Clay was a Kentucky senator, the most famous Kentucky senator and one of the most famous senators in American history, and a slaveholder. His opinion was that you could not have free Blacks and enslaved Blacks coexist in the same community, that would be a crazy maker, to put it lightly. So in this eulogy, Lincoln says of Clay, quote, he considered it no demerit in the society that it tended to relieve slaveholders from the troublesome presence of the free Negroes, end quote. So it's Lincoln describing Clay's endorsement of colonization. By the 1850s, the agitation of slavery over slavery was threatening to divide the Union, as we all know. The prospects for peaceful, lawful abolition looked increasingly distant. Clay's efforts to encourage free Blacks to establish a self-governing colony in Africa met with Lincoln's approval, although Lincoln thought that Central or South America was more hospitable. He thought, as early as 1854, he said the Liberia example or experiment was a disaster, that would never work. So colonization generally did meet with Lincoln's approval until he emancipated slaves on January 1st, 1863. But he was a consistent endorser of colonization up until that point, precisely because the Union was becoming increasingly fractured over the issue of racial slavery in the United States. And he was trying to find a way to facilitate emancipation on the one hand, as well as preserving the Union on the other. She compounds her error by omitting the context of Lincoln's direct and bracing speech to local Black leaders in August 62. This is the one element of Lincoln's presidency that she focuses on very myopically, just let's say. When Lincoln told them to consider the prospects of colonization, and he said this, "Your race suffer greatly, many of them, by living among us, while ours suffer from your presence." When he said that, he was pointing out the pervasive white prejudice that made coexistence in the near term a terrible difficulty. With the nation at war with itself, a white majority with a long-standing prejudice against Black people, Lincoln was preparing Americans for a proclamation of emancipation in rebel-held states. He already had the Emancipation Proclamation drafted. He needed to show the country, and he had a reporter present when he said those provocative words. He needed to have a reporter present so that the country would see that all avenues for resolving the conflict with the rebel states were being pursued before he resorted to emancipation by executive military proclamation. Hannah Jones acknowledges that Lincoln had already drafted the proclamation when he invited these Black leaders to the White House, but was concerned about its reception among white Americans. But then she asserts that Lincoln, quote, also opposed Black equality, end quote. And she cites a comment he made during his 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas. She's not a historian, but she could have gotten this history right if she learned about and presented the context. I mean, if you don't have context, you don't have history. If she presented the context that is essential to understanding why and something was said and what actually was said. So in the first debate, Stephen Douglas, leading Democrat in the 1850s and an outspoken white supremacist, categorically, this is what he said: "I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men, for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." So there's a precursor to George Wallace. That's the context for Lincoln's response. Lincoln was responding to Douglas's unabashed, rank white supremacy in states where Blacks couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on juries if a white man was a defendant, they couldn't serve in the militia, and in fact, in the 1850s, white Illinoisans passed a law banning the immigration of Black people, additional Black people, into the state. It was as if Illinois was competing with Indiana to see who could be most racist among the free states of the Union. That's the context within which Lincoln, the Republican, anti-slavery, was trying to work. Abolitionists at that time, and Lincoln was not an abolitionist, they were viewed as extremists because of their moral absolutism and political indifference. For some, outright hostility toward the Constitution and the rule of law. So Stephen Douglas did everything he could to tar Lincoln and the Republican Party with the abolition brush, whereas Lincoln did what he could to build a bridge from where his acknowledged racially prejudiced, his bigoted citizenry stood to where he wanted them to go, one step at a time. If he couldn't get them all the way there, he was inviting them to take steps towards that. Hannah Jones did quote Lincoln correctly when he said that he was not in favor, at least at that time in the 1850s. He changes this, of course, during the war, but he was not in favor of making Black people, as he put it, politically and socially our equals. But she fails to appreciate that Lincoln had to respond to Douglas in a manner that could appeal to moderate elements of a state where Blacks, as I said, couldn't even enter Illinois. So if you want to think of Lincoln playing the race card, and if we had more time, I could explain why I don't think he is. If Lincoln played the race card, Douglas was playing the whole deck. I would say at the end of the day that Lincoln does not play it the way she portrays. White supremacy was the norm, not the exception. And what is remarkable is the degree to which Lincoln defends the natural rights of Black people. Remember, Blacks can't vote in the state of Illinois. So why is he defending their rights? Why is he reading them in the Declaration and Stephen Douglas is reading them out? This is what Lincoln said: there's no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is as much entitled to these as the white man. When Hannah Jones asserts, quote, anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, and she cites Lincoln's presidency as yet another example of how this played out poorly for Black Americans, she gives no credit to the president who did the most to preserve, protect, and defend, even to the point of war, the Constitution and the kind of country that could secure the rights of racial minorities. So there are sins of commission and sins of omission. She does not mention, right after a paragraph talking about Chief Justice Taney's awful decision in the Dred Scott opinion of 1857, like that's the bridge between the founders and Lincoln. There's no mention of Lincoln's vigorous critique of the Dred Scott opinion by Taney, where he lambasts Taney for reading Black people out of the Declaration. And he laments that all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against them. No mention of the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln delivered in the year of Jubilee, the year where he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and where he challenged the nation to experience a new birth of freedom, a country that will preserve government of the people, by the people, for the people, where that people now includes 3 to 4 million newly freed Blacks. No mention of Lincoln's profound second inaugural address, an oration unsurpassed in its acknowledgement that slavery was a deep-rooted wrong committed by America towards her Black inhabitants, and which the Almighty may have been rectifying by allowing a devastating civil war, which also yielded an emancipation that neither side expected. No mention of Lincoln's repeated advocacy of giving Blacks the vote in 1864 and 65, when only 6 states of the Union allowed Blacks to vote. Of course, there's no mention that Lincoln was assassinated precisely because of these efforts, for which Frederick Douglass called him the first martyr president of the United States. For Lincoln, whose words and deeds remain, in my opinion, the gold standard of political oratory and policy, the United States, but for Lincoln, would have quickly veered from the country that the founders set into motion, a country devoted to equality, individual rights, and government by consent of the governed. What she describes as racist ideology that Jefferson and the framers had used at the nation's founding, Lincoln saw them as the very definitions and axioms of a free society. He understood the predicament of the founders, men who strove to establish a free society upon the principles of equality, rights, consent, while also wrestling with how to wean themselves off of the entrenched practice of slavery. In the last debate that he had with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln observed, "We had slaves among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. Having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties." Stephen Douglas countered by preaching a skewed doctrine of what he called popular sovereignty, teaching white Northerners not to care if the enslavement of Black people spread into the federal territories, and claiming this is what the fathers would have allowed. That Hannah Jones ignores Lincoln's efforts on behalf of Black Americans muddles her attempt to view American history through the lens of Black patriotism. Throughout American history, Black Americans have needed the ideals and institutions, and here's the kicker, as well as the people. Black Americans have needed the people, and most of whom were white, to ensure progress in protecting their civil and political rights. Now, I know Nicole Hannah Jones now claims that she didn't really mean the nation was actually founded in 1619. She was just trying to reframe, as she puts it, how Americans think about their past, how they remember their history. As she puts it, the fight here is about who gets to control the national narrative, and therefore the nation's shared memory of itself, end quote. But her narrative is so flawed that to remember our past the way she does violence, not just to what actually happened historically. It undermines, as I mentioned early in my speech, the civic trust that Americans of all races and ethnicities need to have in each other in order for our diversity to be a strength rather than a weakening, a thing that divides us. Her approach is untrue to the actual history because it leaves out so much of the history, the facts, as she likes to call it. It undermines a due affection for the United States precisely by making this country unlovable, and subverts the trust between citizens of different races in its Manichaean portrayal of American progress as simply a record of heroic Black virtue triumphing over persistent white vice. To include the contribution of white Americans of goodwill is not an indulgence, but a necessary part of the American story. Being honest about the multiracial American story that I consider the long civil rights movement of American history. To do this is not only true to the facts, but also, I believe, promotes the civic health of the body politic. What better way to engender goodwill, trust, friendship among citizens of diverse races than teaching American children a truly comprehensive, truly inclusive history of their country's political birth and development. So, for example, she takes for granted the efforts of white Americans of goodwill, Americans who understood that the country was not founded on slavery. It wasn't intended to be this perpetual institution, but it was founded on equality. That's what whites thought was the basis of their own rights, the basis of anybody's rights. And therefore work to get our practice. These whites work to get our practice to align more closely with our profession. It wasn't just Black Americans who were doing it. Their contribution to the increasing protection of the civil and political rights of Black Americans can be seen in 3 amendments that she mentions in one paragraph, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, the amendments that followed the end of the Civil War. She mentions these amendments and never acknowledges that it was white people who wrote them, white people who lobbied for them, white people who defended them publicly in the face of their constituents and persuaded them that this was the right thing to do. And ultimately, of course, whites who ratified those 3 amendments in 65, 68, and 1870 and at the state level. How else did whites contribute in significant ways towards the struggle? The 1954 unanimous Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, unanimous, all white Supreme Court desegregated public schools in the United States. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without significant white majorities, none of these pivotal constitutional and political events would have occurred. These historical facts were not lost on Joseph H. Jackson, the president of the National Baptist Convention, the largest denomination of Black Christians in the United States. He said, quote, "As a minority group, we cannot win outside the protection and power of the just laws of this land." He said, "Read history with open eyes and attentive minds, and we will discover that no minority group has and can win in a struggle by the direct confrontation of the majority and by employing the same types of pressures and powers that the majority possesses in abundance." So he said, the hope of the minority struggle is with the just laws of the land and the moral and constructive forces that are germane to this nation's life and character. King said the same thing in the I Have a Dream speech in 1964. in 1963, right, where he referred to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as the promissory note, right, where the rights and the promises were to fall heir to every American citizen. And on many occasions, he said, all we ask of America is that you be true to what you said on paper. Despite Nicole Hannah-Jones's claim that for the most part, Black Americans fought back alone, that's her quote, they simply could not have done this without the help of a whole lot of white Americans throughout American history. Perhaps channeling the muse of Ralph Ellison, Hannah-Jones writes that to this day, Black Americans, more than any other group, embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. Now, I argue that this will continue to hold true only if Black Americans continue to learn that the American founding was good, right, yes, even exceptional in its principles and its structures. In his first inaugural address, President Bill Clinton probably said this, the best thing of his whole 2 administrations, when he said that there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. And he was actually echoing what Dwight Eisenhower had said years earlier. If Americans of all races learn that the spirit of 76 reflects, as Lincoln would put it, the better angels of our nature rather than a demon that has to be exorcised, then they can reclaim their common political heritage. All of that past belongs to every single one of us, every single American, regardless of race. Only then can diverse Americans live out their national motto, e pluribus unum, out of many, one, and have a reasonable hope for unity, even as they debate the means by which they seek the common good. But if Americans lack a conviction about the essential goodness of the United States, not only its ideals, but its structures as spelled out in the Constitution, our civic habits like the rule of law, and most importantly, the goodness, or at least equally important, the goodness of diverse American people, a goodness that she makes very difficult to see and understand. Our political polarization will continue to get worse, and what Ellison called the mystique of race will continue to hinder our attempts to understand our diverse, or what he called composite, national identity. In the end, Nicole Hannah-Jones's lead essay for the 1619 Project is a missed opportunity to help Americans understand our past better, therefore enable us to see and trust one another as fellow citizens of a common country. The short shrift she pays to the goodwill of so many white citizens who supported the Black freedom struggle can only sap the trust that is necessary for racial diversity to strengthen rather than weaken our national union. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Lucas. And to the audience, we're going to put some slides up real quickly here with information about how to send in questions. If you're logged in, signed into the YouTube account, you can use the chat function there on YouTube to direct a question to us. If you're not signed in there, or there's some problem with the chat, you can also email any questions to bensoncenter@colorado.edu. Now, I wanted Lucas's talk to stand on its own, but I'm going to go back and revisit my introduction of him, because there are a couple of things that are extremely important that I wanted to highlight. First of all, is he's got a brand new book out. You could have seen it on the overlooking the shoulder in the background while he was speaking, but Lincoln and the American Founding. And I just got a copy of it, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It promises to be a very, very good and important read. He's also been a Madison Fellow at Princeton University. He's a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, and a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln of the Civil War. He was a member of the Scholarly Board of Advisors for the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and he currently serves on the U.S. Sesquicentennial Commission, which is going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States, and if you in a few years. And if you count that out, it's not back to 1619. 250 years back is to 1776, when we'll be celebrating that in just 6 more years. He's been a prolific writer as well, both on Lincoln as well as Ralph Ellison, and what have you. And I can see his expertise comes out in his critique the good, the bad, and the ugly of the 1619 project. All right, so I will begin. I just got a note, my video is frozen. If somebody could let me know whether that's still the case.
Your audio is good.
My audio is good. All right, I'll keep going on the audio. We're having trouble with our internet here, so lovely COVID constraints. Okay, so I will ask one question, because I think one of the most profound insights you bring to this discussion is the notion that if we're going to tribalize ourselves, it's going to be harmful, particularly to the minority groups who are never going to have enough political strength to take on the majority. And if we start redefining ourselves in those tribal ways, that's not going to play out well. Ralph Ellison was right. What we need is not separate identities, but a composite identity. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me the biggest danger of the 1619 project is its denigration of July 4th, 1776. The one thing you didn't mention in your talk, but I'll throw it out here because I know you'll pick and run with this, is Lincoln's famous electric cord speech.
Yes.
Now he's talking about immigrants rather than the former slaves when he gives that speech, but the same principle holds true, it seems to me.
Yes.
And that is, we have no affiliations of kinship, of race, of color, of religion, of a lot of those things that normally ties a people together. And yet we all think we are part of one people because we look back to the Declaration of Independence and it tells us so. And if you remove that electric cord, which the 1619 project is deliberately doing, like taking it away from us, what is there left but tribalism, given the pluralistic society in which we live?
Yeah, I'll see if I can pull out a question from that very astute observation. I actually have that speech in front of me. It's a speech that Lincoln delivered in July of 1858, and where he reflects on July 4th. And he asks, why do we celebrate this day, especially when so many of us are recent immigrants? And he recounts them by their ethnicities. And he says, well, if they look back to the past, they can't be like the daughters of the American Revolution, right? They can't relate themselves directly to the founders who are revered at that time. But he says, if they look back to the Declaration, right, which he says is the father of all moral principle in them. And I got to read this right because you don't butcher Lincoln. He says, if they look back through that history to trace their connection by blood, they find they have none. But when they look through at that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were the blood of the blood and the flesh of the flesh, gloss on Genesis 3, of the men who wrote the Declaration. And so they are. And then this is the kicker, that it is the electric cord in the Declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men. Notice, race isn't anywhere here, whereas Stephen Douglas would be saying whites, white basis. The hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together. That's what will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. So he thinks it's a principle that not only teaches Americans what unites them, not last name, not race, not ethnicity, not nation of birth, but this belief in the principles of humanity. What is it that we all share? Lincoln thought this was not only good and true for the United States, for members of the United States, this is the way we will be a beacon to the world. You mentioned tribalism. Well, this is what I fear is going to happen. Those who are in the minority racially right now, taking their cue from Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton, their 1967 book, Black Power, they're going to do the math, and they're playing the long game. Those who believe this, and what is this? They're saying, you're right, John. We are outnumbered now. But if we follow Malcolm X, who said, but people of color, not just black, but red, yellow, brown, etc., non-whites, we're a majority in the world. And we will soon enough, in a few decades, be a majority, as they calculate it, in the United States. And then who's going to be calling the tune? Here's the problem. You don't mind when majorities call the tune if they at least claim to follow and try to adhere and implement principles that protect the rights of everybody. I fear, though, following this idea that derives from this Black Power book, in Black Lives Matter, I think, as far as I can tell, that's their playbook. What it is teaching some Americans is you have to be in the majority. And when you're in the majority, it's power that counts. It's not ideals. It's not principles. It's not shared humanity. You're right. That's just glittering generalities. And so what I fear is it is teaching people to only look at the numbers. And when the numbers are going their way, then it's freedom for me and not for thee. There's no understanding that the majority, yes, they have the power and the authority to act, but they must act consistent with the rights of the minority. Associate Justice Clarence Thomas said on my campus during the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth in 2009, he says, the most important minority in this country is the minority of one, the individual.
Very good. Well, we've got some questions coming in, and I love the Twitter feeds. Catch Me in the Carpool Lane asks, what part of American culture has prompted such a questioning of the founding, especially considering this is such a seemingly 21st century issue?
Well, this isn't, I want to see if I get this question right. 1619 didn't come out of thin air, okay? She herself has said that an influential book that she read in high school, because the history books weren't telling her story, and she was right about that. She read a book by a guy named Lerone Bennett, who's no fan of Abraham Lincoln. Lerone Bennett is one of the editors, or at least was an editor of Ebony magazine, and he wrote a book called Before the Mayflower. And it essentially gives an account of America that is, in his mind, more inclusive. In other words, it gives it from the perspective of Black people. And she said that that book had a really strong, made a really strong impression on her. And so books like Before the Mayflower, which emphasize the wrongs of America's past at the expense of, totally eclipsing the rights of America's past, and the People's History of the United States, or People's History of America, whatever it is, by Howard Zinn. These are books, especially the Zinn book, these have been in our middle and high schools, either directly shaping our students' minds or shaping the teachers of our students. And so they essentially, the 1619 Project has this very receptive audience, an audience that has been trained for decades to believe that the sophisticated understanding of America's past is that it ain't everything it's cut out to be. You can't believe that equality and rights and consent stuff. Look at the ways in which they faltered. And so, again, maybe I don't know if I'm getting at the person's question right here, but this is something that, as I say, we didn't just turn a corner. This is the culmination of a decades-long attempt to reinterpret America to make it look like, again, racism is systemic and not liberty and equality.
So there was a good follow-up on that. Do you think an expansion of education in our early American political theory could solve this? Or is it deeper than that?
I think, look, I'll preach what I've already been practicing. I have been working with high school teachers for decades. These teachers, I love these teachers. They love this country and they love history. And they want to know what's the latest scholarship on these things. And I find that I am in the minority numerically when it comes to my understanding and appreciation of the debates that produced, the spirit of 76, that produced the Declaration, that produced the Constitution, et cetera. And ultimately that produced a civil war when people didn't want to readopt, some people didn't want to readopt the Declaration of Independence. And so in working with these high school teachers, one problem is that they're not respected. With the great emphasis on STEM in the last 5, 10, 15 years, right? It's all about math and science and very little testing is done. I don't mean to say that this has to be imposed at the national level, but there's very little emphasis placed on understanding our nation's birth, it's both its principles and our practices and the ways in which we fell short. So the old canard about history being one damn thing after the other. I mean, every year they have to teach more history and other history gets crowded out. So let me try to bring this long-winded answer to its end. they just don't have enough time, and they're not given enough time to do these deep dives. And so what I'm trying to do with them is to show them that there are these speeches by, make it a fair fight, by opposing viewpoints about the formation of the Constitution, the formation of the Declaration. Why on earth do we have a civil war? We start shooting at each other. That if the students aren't up to reading the whole speech, then give them some good extracts from those speeches. And number one, don't go in there saying, here is the answer. Tell them, look, that what produced the answer were these very coherent, plausible, vigorous counter arguments. Let's sift these for ourselves. Let's consider them. Let's weigh them. And then let's draw some conclusions about how it is that we ended up with all men are created equal. And yet we continued this practice that had been around since way before 1619, in fact. Why is it that not all slaveholders, some did, some in 6 states did fairly soon? Why was this practice continued? What did they expect was actually going to happen with slavery over time? Again, pre-cotton gin, pre-1792, 1793.
Yeah, I'm always stunned by people like Miss Hannah Jones who seem to write our history as though Roger Taney was correct and Alexander Stephens was correct.
Right.
But what they don't understand, I mean, read the dissents in Dred Scott, who actually had the history right, or read Alexander Stephens's earlier paragraph. He says the Declaration is a self-evident lie, but he acknowledges that Jefferson didn't believe that Jefferson thought it was true, and they fully believed that what they were doing would put slavery out of existence within a couple of decades. But why? These are the people that are attacking America, and yet they're Hannah Jones is acting like that was the true version. Let me lead into another question we've got. I think this is a terrific one. What response would you have to people who point to things like police violence, income inequality, and the disproportionate imprisonment of minorities as evidence for systematic racism?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a fairly logical question to ask after reading not just her essay. Remember, there are 17 other essays. She has been very frank from the get-go of saying that, look, I have this essay I wrote, but she says it is not a history. She says that it's not a history. And then she goes on later to say, you cannot read all these essays and come away from the project thinking that something isn't owed. And she has been candid and honest about saying that the project's intent was to reframe how we understand our path so that we can get reparations. And she's not the first person to argue for reparations, an actual bill that provides not just financial compensation, but investment in communities of need, et cetera. And so if you asked her, give me a one-word explanation for the point of this issue of the New York Times Magazine, what would you want to get out of it? Give me one word. And she would say reparations, without question, because she's said it numerous times. So that's why you have articles on traffic patterns in Atlanta and the consumption of sugar and others. I didn't read all the essays, but I read hers very carefully and numerous times. And so this argument about systemic racism, I think the problem is it's an argument that's operating in a vacuum. Okay, so let's leave aside police brutality for a second. Because, for example, Baltimore City has a black mayor, black police chief, blacks in the police force, and it's still, things still happen there that go beyond protocol. And presuming the protocol isn't systemic racism, since you have black people integrally involved with it. Let's just leave aside these isolated situations for a second. To argue for systemic racism, but on the other hand, say it's blacks that have made this country all the good that it has produced, especially politically. Just to restate her 2 sentences from the beginning, which read like a title because they're separated from the rest of the essay. Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written, 1776. Black Americans have fought to make them true. So, but for Black Americans, she doesn't think all men are created equal is a true statement. Government by consent is a true statement. So she's no political theorist. If you think about racism in this country as being systemic, rather than something in individuals. And of course, and a lot of them, to be sure. This is right out of the early chapters of the Black Power book from Carmichael and Hamilton. It's what they say. The emphasis now in 67 is going to be away from individuals and towards systems and institutions, right? So you don't have to hold any particular person culpable. It's the system. Well, if she says it's blacks that have made those principles true, how did they make them true? If the system was against them, and as she says later, racism is in our DNA, how is it possible? Why did they even think up all men are created equal? Why weren't they more honest, as she understands it, like the Confederates were, where they said, oh my goodness, this Constitution, the old Constitution never even uses the word slave. We're putting it in there. We're going to protect slavery. And read the ordinances of secession, read the Declaration of the Causes of Secession. They're pretty honest about even why they want states' rights. They want states' rights to defend what? The right to own slaves in their own states and to take them into the federal territories. Okay, so if it's systemically racist, how did we achieve progress? How did those Black Americans like Mumbet and Quack Walker, what did they lean on in the system to get free? Not principles from Africa or South America or anywhere in Asia. The principles they seized on and said, wow, this applies to me, were principles and structures written and established by white people to apply as they wrote them to everyone. So for me, what's systemic in the United States, without which we, including Black people, would not have seen any progress, any increase in the security of our civil and political rights. What's systemic are those principles in the Declaration of Independence, because they're universal, right? They apply to everyone throughout time, across the globe. Systemic justice, systemic freedom, systemic liberty, systemic equality is what gives you the standard by which you can determine whether your practice is just or not, and what you can work towards aligning, as Lincoln put it, as fast as circumstances shall permit. We declared the rights and look towards the enforcement of it, the practical security and protection of it over time. That protection, systemic, had to be grounded on true principles of human nature, of humanity, what I've been calling equality, liberty, rights, and consent. So for me, the examples that you gave, we'd have to take them seriatim, one after the other, and show that any of the progress that's being done there is not by the introduction of new principles, but by the application of those old principles in the old Declaration of Independence, and sure, revise any of the police protocols that are leading to these extraneous examples. This isn't par for the course. It's happening more often than it should, obviously, but this isn't standard operating procedure. And if you read her essay, she makes it seem like those things in American history were standard operating procedure.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I've got one last question here that's come in. Why do you think something as this project that is not historically accurate, but claims can be taken as accurate by the mass public?
Number one, it wasn't published in a blog. It wasn't just tweeted out. Now it's too long to be tweeted out. It's 7,300 words there, plus or minus. It was published by what everyone refers to as the American paper of record. This is the New York Times. New York Times Magazine devoted an entire issue of the magazine to her project, 1619, where she assembled a goodly number of individuals to provide essays, poems, photographs and images. The New York Times is all in on this thing. And as I say, the New York Times in this respect is reflecting a more recent revisionist look at American history. And if you've paid attention to my essay, you'll know that I don't think, I'm not saying you don't revise history. Of course you do, okay? But by revisionist history, I mean people who are trying to repackage the past in a particular way that excludes a good number of what actually happened that would counter what the narrative, as we say today, the story that they want to tell. The New York Times has a particular story it wants to tell about this country, and it's not a flattering one. Where they learned it, I think they learned it the same place Nicole Hannah-Jones learned it. They learned it where most of my students at Washington and Lee learn it. They learn it from high school and middle school teachers who have learned it from the graduates of the nation's finest institutions of higher education, where this approach to America, counter to a much older approach, a much more traditional approach, an approach that is much more appreciative of what the founders' challenge was and what they were attempting to do and live up to. It's of recent vintage, but coming with the imprimatur, the Good Housekeeping seal of approval of the New York Times, went a long way to this thing making an impact, and especially at a time where we are with social media and with body cams, frankly, and cell phones, where we can see the individual acts of injustice by people in authority. It's more of a front burner issue for us, and in particular, the white majority in this country. Not all of them, but yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen a survey about the reception of 1619, but a good number of whites feel guilty about our past, and there are things there that any people should feel guilty about. And as a form of penitence and repentance, they believe that they've got to do something to show, we call it virtue signaling, to show that they don't agree with slavery and segregation, that they believe that those things were wrong. And the way to show that belief is to quickly indicate that you support any new understanding of the past where the United States is more bad than good.
So we've got one final question that I think it will give you a great opportunity to end on your high note. But it's. Do you think that July 4th, 1776, and the 1619 project suffer from the same problematic feature, which is a overemphasis on single dates and singular events in the crafting of the two respective histories around those dates? And I think I know where you're going to go with it, but I thought that would be a good way to end.
I don't know. You got an abolitionist like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, who both agree that it is the most important date in American history. With the Nicole Hannah-Jones essay, you basically have someone who is challenging Lincoln's first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, where he says, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. You do the math, and the math takes you not to the Bill of Rights, not to the Constitution, and as you said earlier, not to 1619. It takes you to July 4th. Not July 2nd. I mean, it does the same year, 1776. But when Lincoln says Spirit of 76, he does not say what John Adams said to Abigail Adams. But July 2nd is the day we're going to celebrate. Well, what's up with July 4th? July 2nd is when we actually resolve to declare our independence. July 4th is when we explain to ourselves and the world, if you will, our mission statement, what we will be committed to. And to that extent, I think there is nothing that touches that document. I don't think that in those first two paragraphs, nothing comes close to explaining what it is that the founders intended to do, as Lincoln put it, as fast as circumstances shall permit. And so can you give me an equivalent date? She says 1619, and she crosses out July 4th. I don't think, I think in short, I don't think we overemphasize July 4th. I don't think we emphasize it enough. Perhaps in the olden days, it was just mythology. Perhaps in the olden days, it was treated in a rote fashion, and we didn't really dig down and understand it deeply enough so that we can transmit it to our posterity. So I say, no, I don't think enough attention could be given to July 4th.
And on that, the date that signifies all of the principled foundation for this great regime is why we celebrate today. And with that, Lucas Morel, professor, thank you very much for joining us and contributing your wonderful insight to our Benson Center lecture series this year. And we have coming up, let's see if I can find it real quickly. I had it up ready to go, and here I've lost it all of a sudden. So we've got coming up on November 12th, Joshua Katz speaking about cancellation and its discontents. And then the last of our fall in the Community and Disunity lecture series is our senior visiting scholar, Elizabeth Eastman, Dr. Elizabeth Eastman, From Shadows on the Wall to the Sun, Liberal Education and the Ascent from the Cave. And then we have on November 19th, journalist Barry Weiss, Free Speech and Cancel Culture. January, and then into January, we've got Is Civil Discourse Dead? A conversation with Robbie George and Cornel West. And then starting in the spring component of the Community and Disunity lecture series, Elizabeth Spalding from Claremont McKenna College will be with us on January 26th. Glenn Lowry from Brown University will be on February 8th. We've got former visiting scholar William Allen, one of Lucas's professors from Claremont, will be speaking on February 23rd about George Washington's warning about party faction. And then rounding out the year, Noel Johnson will be speaking on the church and state and the emergence of religious freedom. And on March 16th, the last in our the third of the spring in the Community and Disunity lecture series, Robert Riley will be speaking. And then we're hoping to close in April with a nice Holocaust memorial event with a speech and perhaps a concert by members of the Boulder Symphony. But more details on all of those things are available on the Benson Center's website. And with that, I thank you all for joining us yet again for another very successful lecture in our Community and Disunity lecture series at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. Thank you all very much.